we're trying to understand this from a perspective of the average person in Minnesota right now, or really in the United States, who's maybe watching Minnesota and going, "Wow, what's going on in the upper Midwest over there?" Because a lot of people picture Minnesota as this, relatively conservative, rural state. Outside of the Twin Cities and now Rochester, I mean, for the most part, everybody lives, as our governor affectionately refers to us, as rocks and cows. Um, a lot of people have this view of Minnesota being very rural and therefore, ostensibly conservative. And they're kind of waking up and saying, what's going on in Minnesota? And even Minnesotans are saying that, like, how did we get here? What happened? And a lot of them are looking back and saying, oh, it's the last 10 or 15 years. And as we talked about the other day, this isn't just happening in the last 10, 15 years. This has been going on for over 100 years in Minnesota. Share a little bit with us about the history of the Marxist influence in our great state.
Well, it first started back in the 1840s when Marx tried to have a revolution in Germany, and that revolution was crushed. But a lot of German Marxists left Germany and came to the Midwest, mainly to Milwaukee and Illinois, but some to Minnesota as well. And they had socialist mayors in Milwaukee. They set up the Communist Party in Chicago. So there was all that early communist influence came into the Twin Cities right back in the 1850s. But the real push came in about 1905, because in those days Finland was part of the Russian Empire. And in 1905, there was a communist revolution in Russia, and it failed. The Tsar smashed it down, and thousands of Finnish communists left Finland in fear of their lives and moved to America. And what was the part of America that was most like Finland? It was the upper half of Minnesota, the Iron Range. So thousands of communist Finns poured into the Iron Range, and they ran it like a communist community. They had big co-ops. They had hammers and sickles on the bread delivery vans. They had big communist social halls. The Iron Range was a communist bastion. The head of the Communist Party for 40 years, Gus Hall, was originally an Iron Range Finn. That's where he grew up. That was his communist family background. So normally in a Midwestern state, the rural areas are very conservative and the cities tend to be more liberal. But Minnesota had problems right from the start, because a large swath of your rural areas in the north were communist. So you had rural conservatives in the south, leftist liberals in the big cities, and a communist north. So you always had a left-wing tilt in Minnesota that other Midwestern states didn't have to put up with. And that bled into, in the 1940s, the Communist Party set up in the 1930s, the Communist Party set up the Farmer Labor Party. They had elected a Communist Party member, Bernstein, as a congressman, one of the few open communists ever to serve in Congress. And then the Farmer Labor Party amalgamated with the Democratic Party to form the DFL, the Democratic Farmer Labor Party you have today. So that had communist roots as well. So you had a communist North and you had a communist influenced Democratic Party right from the 1930s. So that's a big contributing factor to why Minnesota has gone down the socialist road so quickly.
And so everybody's aware, Trevor is not this person who just sees a communist or a Marxist behind every blade of grass. This is researchable history, that you can find this openly. You don't even have to get off of the mainstream search engines. You can do this on mainstream search engines. You can go to Wikipedia. They don't have any issue with communicating this. And
They're
so,
proud of it.
yeah, they're proud of it, right? Trevor, I was going to ask a question, and we didn't talk about this the other night, but I'm aware. I would assume you're aware of the House Un-American Activities Committee from the early 1900s, and then how that led into the McCarthy hearings. How, so we know that Alinsky managed to escape being hauled before the McCarthy hearing committee and HUAC. How did Minnesota Marxists and communists within that movement in the north and down into the Twin Cities area, how did they manage to survive that? Because it destroyed a lot of careers and a lot of organizations that were Marxists and communists at the time. How did Minnesota manage to see their Marxists weather that storm?
Well, I think there wasn't a lot of attention paid to Minnesota, to be honest. They were more focusing on California, on Hollywood, on Washington, D.C., New York, Philadelphia, places like that. So the Midwest largely escaped attention, and there were communist parties in Iowa and Nebraska and obviously Michigan was pretty heavily concentrated on because the communists were so strong there in the auto unions and basically took over Detroit. But there wasn't a lot of focus on Minnesota because Minnesotans are just too nice and nobody really believed there could be a revolution in Minnesota. So the communist movement in Minnesota came through that time largely unscathed. And, but you had people like Walter Mondale and all these others who were very close to the communist elements in the DFL. And, Governor Dayton and all these people, all of them had a history with the movement. But in Minnesota, it was more or less accepted as normal. Nobody really called these people out. There wasn't the
Sorry about that, guys. A little bit of technical difficulty. We'll bring everybody
That's
back up
all right.
on here.
There we go. Where were
that's
you?
all right.
Take it away, Trevor.
But so the communism survived here. The Communist Party prospered, and into the 60s, you had the Maoist movements coming out. You had the Democratic Socialist movements coming up. So communism was splitting into different factions, and all of them had a base in Minnesota. The Maoists were very strong in St. Paul and the Twin Cities, and they led into what we now know as the Freedom Road Socialist Organization. They're the people who burnt your cities after the George Floyd, when George Floyd was killed. They had that all organized, ready to go. Not the George Floyd killing, but they were going to do violence in your state. Freedom Road Socialist Organization is actually headquartered in the Twin Cities, and they're pro-Chinese communists. And then you had the Democratic Socialists of America, which is also a communist movement, which is very strong in the Twin Cities, and have chapters in Rochester and Duluth and other areas around the state. But another very big driver for all of this was the Wellstone movement of the 80s and the 90s. I know a lot of you people in Minnesota. You know Paul Wellstone very well. He's a bit of a legend in your state. But hardly anybody knows he was a full-on Marxist. He was actively leading young. He was in the New American Movement, which was came out of the Communist Party and SDS, Students for a Democratic Society. He moved into Democratic Socialists of America, worked with them, set up student chapters at Carleton College, I believe he was teaching. The Democratic Socialists of America got him elected. They got him elected to the US Senate and were going to get him elected. He was going to stand for president before he was killed. He was the Bernie Sanders before Bernie Sanders. But he was hardcore radical, and they set up a Wellstone training school to honor him. And that was run by socialists and Marxists. And many of your leading politicians in the state are on the advisory board for that organization. Walter Mondale was on the advisory board, for instance. R.T. Ryback, who was the mayor of Minneapolis, was on that board. You know, you had a socialist mayor of St. Paul, Greiber, a few years ago. So this movement set up a Wellstone school that trained Keith Ellison, your Attorney General. It trained Tim Walz, your governor. It trained your deputy governor, the Native American lady. I've just forgotten her name. So all of those three
Peggy
officers
Flanagan.
came out of the Wellstone school, as did Amy Klobuchar, your senator. She has an extensive Marxist background. She came out of the Wellstone movement. And even Tina Smith, to some degree, is associated with that movement. So that Wellstone Marxist movement basically runs Minnesota today and works with the Democratic Socialist people in all of the major cities and is on very friendly terms in some ways with the large Maoist movement in your state. So you've got a lot of communist influences in your state even today, and that goes back 100 years, which sort of explains why Minnesota has had a bit of a hard time, you know, getting back to the conservative constitutional state that it should be.
No wonder why I love the oil field of North Dakota so much. And since I'm just actually learning about all of this, you know, at my most frustrated moments, I've made comments like, I'm not going to let these commie bastards win. So I actually was very correct in what I was saying.
You absolutely were. You know, your governor was trained at a Marxist school. Your attorney general was trained at a Marxist school. You know, Keith Ellison, we used to hold fundraisers in the home of the head of the Minnesota Communist Party. You know, Amy Klobuchar's father used to take her on bicycle tours of the Soviet Union as a young woman. She was heavily involved in Democratic Socialists of America and still is. So you've got this Marxist current that runs your state. And here's another example of this. Remember when Al Franken just beat, who was the senator? He beat the Republican senator after a long series of recounts in 2008. Norm Coleman. He beat Norm Coleman. And it went on forever. It went on. They kept on finding more votes. Well, your Secretary of State at that time was Mark Ritchie. Mark Ritchie was attending secret meetings with the Communist Party around that time. So Mark Ritchie, your Secretary of State, was involved with the Communist Party, and he made darn sure that Al Franken got that Senate seat and not the Republican. And that Senate seat was what it took to get Obamacare passed.